Can someone please explain to me why we are letting legal adults out of legally binding contracts? And why taxpayers are bearing the burden of this repayment? Imagine you walk into a car dealership. You're 18 years old, legally an adult. You pick out a car, not the practical sedan that gets you to work, but the flashy sports model you've always dreamed of. You sign the financing paperwork. You drive it off the lot. 5 years later, you come back to the dealership and say, "I can't afford the payments. Can you just cancel the debt?" They'd laugh you out of the building. But in America today, that's essentially what the student loan forgiveness movement is asking, except instead of the dealership eating the cost, it's your neighbor, your plumber, your waitress, the truck driver who never set foot on a college campus, the taxpayer. Today we're going to have the conversation that most media outlets are too afraid to have honestly, because the student loan forgiveness debate isn't really about compassion. It's about accountability, personal responsibility, and who actually pays when we pretend consequences don't exist. Segment 1, the contract nobody forced you to sign. Let's start with the most fundamental fact in this entire debate, one that gets glossed over constantly in mainstream coverage. Every single person with a federal student loan signed a legally binding promissory note. Every one of them. A promissory note is not a suggestion. It is not a wish list. It is a contract, one of the most basic and foundational concepts in American law. It says, I received this money. I agree to pay it back. With interest. On a defined schedule. And here's the part that matters most, you had to be at least 18 years old to sign it. At 18, you are a legal adult in the United States of America. You can vote. You can join the military. You can get married. You can sign contracts. And when you sign a contract as a legal adult, you are bound by it. That is not cruelty. That is the foundation of a functioning society. Nobody held a gun to anyone's head. Nobody was dragged into a financial aid office against their will. These were choices, made by adults, with access to information, with the ability to ask questions, with the ability to walk away. College advisors, financial aid offices, and the internet all existed. The terms of the loan, the interest rate, the repayment period, the total amount owed, were spelled out in black and white before anyone signed anything. The argument that borrowers didn't understand what they were getting into doesn't hold up legally or morally. If a 19-year-old is mature enough to vote for president, mature enough to be deployed to a war zone, mature enough to enter a marriage, they are mature enough to understand that borrowing $80,000 means paying back $80,000 plus interest. Personal responsibility doesn't disappear because the debt becomes inconvenient. Segment 2, the choice nobody wants to talk about. Here's where the conversation gets uncomfortable, because it requires us to talk honestly about choices. Not just the choice to borrow money, but the choice of what to borrow it for. Not all degrees are created equal. That is not an opinion. That is a documented, measurable, economic reality. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York publishes data on the earnings of college graduates by major. The gap between the highest and lowest earning fields is staggering, and it matters enormously when we're talking about who can and cannot repay a student loan. Let's talk numbers. A graduate with a degree in petroleum engineering has a median early career salary of around $93,000. Computer science graduates earn a median of around $70,000 to start. Nursing graduates enter the workforce at roughly $60,000 to $65,000. These graduates, even with significant loan debt, have a clear, realistic path to repayment. Now let's look at the other end of the spectrum. A graduate with a degree in fine arts has a median early career salary of approximately $36,000. Drama and theater arts, around $35,000. Studio art, around $36,000. Social work, around $35,000. Early childhood education, under $35,000 in most states. Anthropology, around $36,000. Philosophy, roughly $40,000 to start, in a field where a bachelor's degree alone rarely leads to meaningful employment. Now let's do simple math. If you borrowed $60,000 to earn a degree in art history and you're earning $34,000 a year, before taxes, you are in a structural crisis that no amount of good intentions will resolve. You cannot repay that loan on that salary without significant sacrifice or a dramatic career change. But here's the critical question that the forgiveness movement refuses to answer honestly: whose fault is that? The information was available. The salary data for every major field of study has been publicly accessible for decades. The Bureau of Labor Statistics publishes it. College websites publish it. Guidance counselors discuss it. The data on what jobs exist, how many of them there are, and what they pay, that information did not require a research team to find. And beyond salary, there's the issue of market saturation. Take psychology. It is consistently one of the most popular undergraduate majors in the United States. Hundreds of thousands of students graduate with psychology degrees every year. But the number of actual clinical positions, research positions, and meaningful psychology-specific careers that those degrees directly qualify graduates for is a tiny fraction of that output. The vast majority of psychology bachelor's degree holders end up in fields entirely unrelated to psychology, earning salaries that bear no relationship to the debt they took on to get that degree. The same is true for communications, sociology, gender studies, criminal justice at many institutions, and dozens of other programs that universities aggressively market to 17-year-olds without adequately disclosing the economic realities of those fields. Was that deceptive on the part of universities? In some cases, yes, and that's a legitimate and separate conversation about institutional accountability. But the borrower still signed the note. The borrower still had access to the data. And the borrower still made the choice. Segment 3, the taxpayer who never went to college. Now let's talk about the person nobody in the student loan forgiveness debate wants to put front and center. The taxpayer. According to the Federal Reserve, roughly 38% of American adults have a 4-year college degree. That means 62% of American adults do not have a 4-year degree. These are the electricians, the plumbers, the mechanics, the construction workers, the farmers, the truck drivers, the factory workers, the retail employees, the food service workers. Many of them are earning modest salaries. Many of them are living paycheck to paycheck. Many of them made a deliberate choice not to go to college, or simply could not afford to go, and built their lives accordingly. Now the federal government is asking these people to absorb the cost of canceling debt for college graduates. Let that sit for a moment. A 45-year-old electrician who went to trade school, earned a certification, built a small business, and is paying off his own mortgage and his own truck payments. He is being asked to subsidize the debt of someone who spent 4 years at a university studying a field with limited job prospects and is now asking to be relieved of the financial consequences of that decision. There is no coherent ethical argument for why that is fair. None. The Congressional Budget Office estimated that President Biden's initial broad student loan forgiveness plan would cost between $400 billion and $600 billion over 10 years. That money does not appear from nowhere. It comes from tax revenue. It comes from every working American, regardless of whether they went to college, regardless of whether they made financially responsible choices, regardless of whether they would benefit in any way from the policy. This is a wealth transfer, from the less educated and often lower-earning working class, to a population of college graduates who, on average, earn significantly more over their lifetimes than those without degrees. That is not progressive policy. That is arguably the opposite. Segment 4, the people who already paid. The federal student loan program has existed since 1958, when the National Defense Education Act created the first government-backed student loans in response to the Sputnik crisis. Since then, tens of millions of Americans have borrowed money for college. And the overwhelming majority of them, quietly, without fanfare, without political campaigns or protests, paid their loans back. Think about that generation. The Americans who went to college in the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, the early 2000s. They faced their own economic challenges. Recessions. Inflation. Job market disruptions. Many of them struggled. Many of them worked second jobs. Many of them sacrificed vacations, delayed buying homes, drove old cars, and made financial decisions they didn't want to make, all to honor the contract they signed. They were held accountable. Nobody showed up to cancel their debt. Nobody organized a political movement to absorb their obligations. They did what they said they would do when they signed the promissory note. Now consider the borrower who paid off their loans just 5 years ago. Or 3 years ago. Or last year. They did everything right. They honored their commitment. They made the sacrifices. And now the government is considering telling the person who borrowed the same amount at the same time, but didn't pay, that their debt is simply gone. What message does that send? It tells every future borrower that contracts are negotiable. That if enough people default or complain loudly enough, the government will step in and make the consequences disappear. It creates what economists call a moral hazard, a situation where removing consequences from a behavior encourages more of that behavior. If student loan forgiveness becomes standard policy, the logical response for every future student is to borrow as much as possible and wait for the next forgiveness program. Why sacrifice to pay off your debt when history shows you might not have to? This doesn't just punish responsible borrowers. It corrupts the entire system going forward. Segment 5, the universities get away clean. Here's the part of this story that makes my blood boil, because in every single version of the student loan forgiveness debate, one party walks away completely untouched. The universities. Harvard University has an endowment of over $50 billion. Yale is over $40 billion. Stanford over $36 billion. These are not struggling nonprofits. These are financial empires with tax-exempt status. Between 1980 and 2020, the cost of college tuition increased by more than 1,200%, far outpacing inflation, far outpacing wage growth, far outpacing any reasonable measure of value added. Why did tuition skyrocket? In significant part because the federal government made essentially unlimited loan money available to students, and universities knew it. When you guarantee that an 18-year-old can borrow whatever amount is needed to attend your institution, you remove all market pressure to keep costs reasonable. Universities raised prices because they could. Because the loans were always there. The federal student loan program didn't just enable the debt crisis, it helped create it. And now, when the forgiveness debate happens, nobody is talking about clawing back a single dollar from those university endowments. Nobody is requiring universities to share in the cost of the debt they help generate by raising tuition at obscene rates. Nobody is holding the institutions accountable. The universities recruited the students. The universities cashed the tuition checks. The universities grew their endowments and built luxury dormitories and hired armies of administrators. And when the bill comes due, they face zero consequences. If there is going to be any serious policy conversation about student debt, it must include mandatory accountability for the institutions that created the problem. A forgiveness program that lets universities off the hook entirely is not a solution. It's a bailout for everyone except the taxpayer who funds it. Segment 6, what real accountability looks like. Now I want to be clear about something. Acknowledging that blanket student loan forgiveness is unfair, fiscally irresponsible, and ethically problematic does not mean ignoring that the higher education financing system in America has real and serious problems. It does. The cost of college is genuinely out of control. Predatory for-profit institutions have defrauded students. The guidance given to 17-year-olds about the financial realities of their degree choices has often been negligent or dishonest. These are real problems. They deserve real solutions. But the solution is not to transfer hundreds of billions of dollars in debt from people who chose to borrow it to taxpayers who had no say in the matter. Real accountability looks like this. First, hold predatory institutions accountable. Colleges and universities that consistently produce graduates who cannot repay their loans should face financial consequences, reduced access to federal loan programs, mandatory refunds, potential loss of accreditation. Second, require honest disclosure. Before any student takes on a loan for any degree program, they should receive clear, mandatory information about average starting salaries in their chosen field, average debt loads for graduates of that program, and the historical loan repayment rates of graduates from that specific institution. Third, reform the loan system going forward. Cap the amount the federal government will lend for degrees in fields with demonstrably poor employment outcomes. Create income share agreements as an alternative, where institutions have skin in the game and a financial interest in their graduates' success. Fourth, expand and promote vocational training. Trade school graduates and the skilled trades regularly out-earn four-year college graduates, without the debt. Electricians, plumbers, HVAC technicians, and welders are in massive demand. These are honorable, well-paying careers that the culture has systematically undervalued while pushing every young person toward a four-year degree regardless of whether it makes financial sense for them. These are solutions that don't require punishing taxpayers for other people's decisions. Segment 7, the fairness argument, final thoughts. At its core, this debate is about one word: fairness. Is it fair that some people struggle to repay their student loans? Yes, in many cases, the system failed them, the institutions misled them, and the cultural pressure to attend a four-year university regardless of financial reality set them up for hardship. But is it fair to take that struggle and distribute its cost across every American taxpayer, including the ones who never went to college, The ones who worked extra jobs to pay off their own loans? The ones who chose trade school or community college specifically because they couldn't afford more debt? No. It is not. Compassion and accountability are not opposites. We can acknowledge that the system is broken and still insist that contracts matter. We can recognize that some people made poor choices and still refuse to make everyone else pay for them. We can demand reform of predatory institutions without handing a blank check to every borrower regardless of circumstance. The student loan forgiveness debate deserves honest, uncomfortable conversation, not political slogans dressed up as economic policy. Because somewhere right now, a plumber is paying his taxes. A nurse is making her loan payment. A veteran who used the GI Bill and worked 2 jobs to cover the rest is watching the news. They honored their commitments. They deserve a government that honors the principle that in America, when you sign your name to something, it means something. So explain to me why we are paying other citizens' debts? Why do they get out of it when everyone before them paid their own way? Why are we enabling these students with pointless degrees to get out of their responsibilities? Doesn't seem very fair to me. Please like and follow for more videos where we continue to explore problems that affect all of us.